in a sense, qualifying, the notion that the Chinese are simply moving into South Asia. Similarly, let's look at military power. Now, in one sense, quite clearly, China's military power is far outpacing that of India. And you can see that when you look at India's military spending as a percentage of China's, that from 98% in 1990, these are at constant to 2010 dollars, it is now just 34%. So I mean, there's a huge gap opening up here. Okay? But we'll come back to this and what is the significance of this. Looking at South Asian arms imports. Now look, if you look at that, you will see that China is the largest exporter of arms, or China is the largest source of arms to Bangladesh and Pakistan, both around 40%, but India is the largest to Nepal at 50%, and Israel actually, surprise, is the largest with regard to Sri Lanka, not China. Nevertheless, China's role is growing. So, in effect, we can see for Bangladesh, China is the primary source, Pakistan, China is the primary source, for Nepal, India is the primary source, and Sri Lanka, Israel is the primary source, but China is close behind. So what does all this mean for China's influence in South Asia? I mean, this finally we are coming to the nub. I think China's global power is significant but constrained. Firstly, it has a relatively low per capita GDP, which is going to remain relatively low down into the middle of the century. Second, the limited military spending capacity precisely because of this low per capita GDP. And third, a point that is rarely mentioned actually in much of the writings, and that is that China is going to be under domestic stress. Now this is something that I'm not talking much about right now, but we can talk about it when during the Q&A, and that is the compatibility of political and economic systems. Nobody knows exactly where China is going. But one thing we do know, I think, we can take for granted is that the Chinese simply cannot spend the way that the Soviet Union spent during the Cold War. Let's look at China in South Asia. Clearly the rise is rapid, but there are limits. As I said, China has a hierarchy of interests. The top interest is dealing with the US, second interest dealing with Japan, and third, if you want to put it that way, and there may be an argument about this, is South Asia. Perhaps precisely because, as Professor Muniz said, it is a vulnerable underbelly. So, because of the fact that South Asia is the third in the hierarchy of interest, because of the fact that China has serious limitations in the kind of investment it can make, by which I mean strategic investments, military and economic. These strategic investments in South Asia are actually likely to grow quite slowly. Besides, there are regional constraints. One is economic competition from India. Let us not forget that India's presence in Nepal is rising, in Sri Lanka and in Pakistan as well, and that it is going to. I'm not saying that it will, be able to beat China at that game. Perhaps not for a while, but it is competitive. And as far as military competition is concerned, the Chinese have competition from both India and others in arms transfers from India, from Israel, from Russia, and from naval power, the US and India. I mentioned particularly that one thing I felt was a little low-key in the book was actually sort of the elephant in the room, the United States. That the United States, everybody thinks of it as a declining power. Some of the figures you have seen earlier show that it was not. My point is that you cannot think of the strategic politics of the region without thinking of the major role that the United States is playing and is going to play. And in this context, the US-India linkage is particularly significant as a blockage to Chinese ambitions. And lastly, India has two distinct advantages. I think one has already been mentioned, the problem of distance. And the fact is that vis-a-vis influence with China, with India's neighbors, I can, I think fairly confidently assert that India enjoys a huge advantage in terms of geographic distance. I think whatever the neighbors might do, particularly say Sri Lanka or Nepal or Bangladesh, they are going to be very, very careful not to antagonize India by unduly encouraging a strong Chinese presence. Pakistan is an exception. I have no doubt about that, and that is because it is a nuclear weapons power and in any case is able to resist Indian hegemony. Finally, a strategic shift. Whose strategic shift am I talking about? I'm talking about India's strategic shift. If you look at the history of India particularly from the 1950s till today, then you see you can divide it into two phases. One up till about 1990 and the second after about 1990. And in the first of those phases, India was clearly, not necessarily so strong, but certainly for the neighbors resembled something of a predatory hegemon, which was willing to intervene, which was willing to use its economic and even its military power, and was willing to break up Pakistan, intervene in Sri Lanka, blockade Nepal, and so on and so forth, and bring them to their knees. If you look at a picture after 1990, the picture is completely the opposite. India's real power is actually growing, both economic and military, but its kind of proclivity for intervention is declining. In fact, you see, people arguing that why doesn't India be more active outside its immediate sphere? But India has not intervened in places where it has been invited to intervene: Sri Lanka, Iraq, and to some extent Afghanistan. So if we look at that way, India now presents a more attractive kind of appeal to its immediate neighbors, and that in itself makes it more competitive vis-a-vis China, given that China has a problem of strategic distance. So conclusions, the three questions that I started with: what exactly is the likely strategic impact of China's rising profile in South Asia? The answer is limited. Is China a major South Asian power, or is it going to be? The answer is no. And how real are Indian fears of containment? The answer is exaggerated. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajesh. And then last panelist, Mr. Kwok.
Thank you, Senator Pao. I'd like to thank one very old friend, Tan Tayong, and an old friend, Muni, for inviting me to comment on their book. Known Prof. Tan for more years than I can remember from the former days. And Prof. Muni, I think I welcomed you to the old Institute of Defense Studies on your first long visit to Singapore. Now, what this means is for all of you who have reviewed books or commented on books by friends and colleagues, that it places great restraints on what you can say. So with that caveat, let me first say that I join Mohan in saying that the 9 chapters of this book are very comprehensive and substantive review of how the 6 countries of South Asia relate to China, and they provide very solid material for further analysis of the subcontinent's relation to China. The focus of all the chapters are very much on state-to-state relations of these 6 countries with China from the perspectives of mainly bilateral political, economic, and security relations. And they all generally project a fairly positive perception of China. But, as the various authors and editors also note in Muni's conclusion, how 5 of these countries relate to China is in part determined by how the largest neighbor relates to China. And this is a point I think that I want you to emphasize in. But then I would disagree with you, Raja, that the China card presents a new option for these South Asian neighbors. I think it's more like logistics. China is far away. India is right there on their doorstep. This was brought to me very vividly on a visit to Pakistan, to Bhutan. This was the year before the king announced his desire to abdicate. So as you know, in Bhutan, the roads are very narrow and go winding in hairpin bend around the hills. And as I was going around one of the hairpin bends, we were almost pushed off the road and down the ravine by this long convoy of very large Indian army trucks. And the driver had to pull to the side of the road and let this convoy pass. And I looked at my guide and I said, is this usual? He says, sometimes more, sometimes less. So I said, and today, less. So if you're the Bhutanese, you know, that Indian army presence in your country must shape how you relate to that distant power of China. And I think here, Lodi's chapter on Pakistan also makes it very clear that its relations with India, especially over Kashmir, shapes how it looks at China. So we all look at the Karakoram highway today, strategic and all that. But to me, when I drove on that highway with all these beautiful Chinese decorated bridges, it's more symbolic. I mean, I got as far as Resurgent. And then the guy said, no, you can't go, this is Stienberg. I said, why? Well, I was then trying to get to the border. He said, well, I can bring you to the border. I can't guarantee I'll get you back. Get you right out. I said, why? You look at all that rocks up there. They're going to go tumbling down on the road, and you're not going to get back. So, to me, that highway is more a symbol of that region's whole relations with China, which Pakistan today is trying to appropriate and claim that just as that part of Northwest India was China's outlet to the world in ancient times, so is Pakistan the outlet to the world for China today. But again, I'm not sure how good that is. But my point is that this sort of a relations should be further explored and developed in this book. Likewise with Afghanistan. Roger, I think actually spot on. Our Chinese colleagues will have a very difficult problem when the Americans pull out in 2014. And Heng Wing, my good friend, can confirm, when you talk to your Chinese think tank colleagues in Beijing, what do they tell you? You know, there's a big problem. Yes, we don't know how to solve it. But when push comes to shove, I think they're going to go into Afghanistan. And that will, I think, change the dynamics there. The other point about the book, which I thought could be developed more, is that how India's border dispute with China itself, Arunachal Pradesh, Sikkim, Jammu, Kashmir, and even joining China, how do these border disputes affect Sino-Indo relations? And as you all know, it's far away from China, but India is very real. I trekked in northern Sikkim. The problem there is there. Every few kilometers, you see this conglomerate of army huts, Nissan huts that's built there. Not used, not occupied, but well maintained. Quite clearly, for them to, these are the bases for Indian army units when there's a crisis there. So, I think there's a problem there. The other issue that is not mentioned in the book, which I thought should be developed further, is the management of waters. And I'm thinking here in particular of the Galung Brahmaputra River as an issue with China, India, Bangladesh relations here. So, and I'll leave it at that. Finally, on Tibet. Muni, you talk about Tibet, but it's a factor, but it's not mentioned. And I know you'll tell me afterwards that it's not that important, or should not be that important. Tibet as a factor in China-India relations and how it affects India's neighbors. I will give you two examples here. In the late 1980s, when I was visiting Sikkim, I went to the biggest monastery there, the Rumtek Monastery. It was abandoned and then rebuilt by the 16th Compatibility. And when he died, there was a big issue over who was to be the next, the 17th Compatibility. And there were two contenders. Trini Taya Dorje or Organ Trini Dorje. And so when I went back on later visits to Sikkim, to Gangtok in 1992 onwards, there were police guards all over the Rumtek Monastery. What's happened? Oh, because of this controversy. But it's more than that. Hints that there's a Chinese hand in all of this. China is secretly supporting one of these candidates to be the 17th Compatibility. And I think it's an issue you will have to India to live with. You may want to forget India, Tibet, but Tibetans will not forget. And I have a final example here. Last year, I think it was March, when I was in New Delhi for a conference. And our host very kindly put us up in a club that was a member of near Lodi Park, historic park with a beautiful mountain. Huh? Yes, yeah. So I stayed on the day after the conference to go and do some other business. I think with Taiyang visiting Manohar and all that. So I left at 9 o'clock in the morning. How come there are so many policemen around the whole park? How was that? But I thought nothing of it. I came back at 11:30 in the little tuk-tuk. I was stopped by this policeman, and before I knew it, I was physically dragged out of the tuk-tuk. The tuk-tuk driver was shocked. What's happening? One of them thrust me on here, another here, pushed me to the back, and literally half carried me, dragged me down the road 50 meters to their temporary police post, where I was presented to the inspector. Passport was taken from me, and I was thinking, what's going on? Oh, you are a suspect in a police operation. What have I done? I'm a suspect. I mean, I'm a tourist here, see? Telephone calls, and then an assistant soup comes down. He looks at my passport, ate with his colleagues, then he goes. And those three policemen physically carried me back to where they dumped me there. What's happening? I called up my friends. Hey, can you check why is this so? All kind of oh, there was a very high-level Chinese delegation visiting Lodi Park, and the police got information that these Tibetans were going to infiltrate the park and launch a big protest. And unfortunately, you fitted the profile. So, well, whatever you tell me about Tibet, ignoring Tibet, Tibetans will not forget you. On that note, thank you.
Thanks for the story, Mr. Guo. We have a bit more time than we anticipated. So, Professor Muni and Professor Tan, do you want to take 5 minutes to address what's said first? Okay. What I'll do is I open the floor for question and answer. I'll take about 3 or 4 questions at one go so that the speakers can address them as quickly as they can. Please introduce yourself, keep your comment and your question really brief. If you have a specific question for a specific panel member, then please